The notice was the first thing I saw when I opened my front door that morning, and for a split second, I thought it was some kind of joke. A bright piece of paper, taped right where everyone walking by could see it. The bold red letters nearly shouted at me, "Remove your boat immediately or face fines." I stood there barefoot on my porch, the early sun rising over the lake behind me, and I just froze. I read the words once, twice. A third time, slower, as if the message would somehow change if I looked carefully enough. But it didn't. They wanted me to move my boat. My boat. The one tied neatly at the end of my dock, sitting on calm water like it belonged there. Because it did belong there. I clenched the paper in my fist and looked out at the lake. Mist floated. Above the surface, thin and silver, while ducks paddled across the water like they didn't have a care in the world. It was beautiful, peaceful. The same view that had made me fall in love with this place years ago. And now some neighborhood committee thought they could strip that peace away with a single slip of paper. Of course, I knew exactly who was behind. At the HOA. If you've ever dealt with one, you know the type. Always watching, always ready to enforce rules no one remembers agreeing to. And ours was worse than most, run by a woman named Karen. Yes, that was really her name. She wore it like armor, like it was her destiny to make other people's lives more difficult. She had this sharp bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, and a voice that carried across the street whenever she decided to scold someone for not trimming their hedges or leaving their trash can out too long. I'd tried to stay on her good side. I kept my yard neat. I never left my truck parked on the street overnight. I nodded politely when she waved, even though half the time her smile didn't reach her eyes. But I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before she set her sights on me. And apparently that time had arrived. The ridiculous thing was that my boat wasn't bothering anyone. It wasn't parked in the street or blocking a neighbor's view. It wasn't noisy or dangerous. It was just there. My quiet escape after long workdays. My way of slipping out onto the water when I needed air, or peace, or just a break from the noise of the world. That boat was more than fiberglass and paint. It was freedom. And yet, according to this notice, it was now an eyesore that violated community standards. Community standards. I almost laughed, because if there was one thing this community had, it was double standards. Karen's husband parked his trailer in their driveway for weeks at a time, and no one dared say a word. Another board member had built a shed practically leaning onto his neighbor's fence, but that was conveniently overlooked. My boat, though? That was the problem. I could already picture the meeting where they voted on it. Karen standing at the front of the clubhouse, fanning herself with papers, acting like she was saving the neighborhood from chaos. A few nods from the board, a mutter of agreement, and just like that, another rule born, another fine threatened. But here's the thing. They didn't realize. This wasn't just some neighborhood pond they could boss people around about. This was my lake. My name was on the deed. I had bought it years before half these houses were built, when the land was still considered too wild, too quiet, too far from the city to matter. Developers had built around it later, selling families on the dream of lakefront living. But the water, that belonged to me. Every ripple, every fish, every inch of shoreline that touched these homes, it was mine. And suddenly, with that notice crumpled in my hand, I felt something shift inside me. For years, I had been generous. I'd let everyone fish. I'd let them kayak, canoe, swim, and host their little HOA-sponsored fishing tournaments on weekends. I'd never asked for a dime, never enforced restrictions, never reminded anyone that technically they needed my permission, because I believed in being neighborly. I believed in sharing the beauty I was lucky enough to own. But standing there on my porch, staring out at my boat rocking gently in the water, I realized something important. Generosity is fragile. It only works when it's respected. And the HOA had just crossed the line. I wasn't angry yet. Not exactly. What I felt was colder, sharper, a kind of determination that rose slowly in my chest. Because if Karen and her board thought they could bully me into towing my boat out of the place where it rightfully belonged, then they had no idea what storm they were about to unleash. The funny part? They really thought they had power. They thought a few lines of community bylaws could outweigh a property deed. They thought fines could scare me into submission. But they had no clue that their fishing club, their events, their family weekends by the water, all of it existed only because I allowed it. And now, thanks to one arrogant notice, that was about to change. I didn't waste time. The very next evening, I walked into the HOA meeting holding that notice like it was evidence in a trial. The clubhouse smelled faintly of coffee and air freshener, the kind meant to cover up mildew. Folding chairs lined the walls, and at the front, a long table held the board members. And there she was, Karen, sitting right in the middle, chin tilted high, acting like she owned the place. The chatter died the second I stepped inside. Heads turned. Some neighbors gave me sympathetic looks. Others avoided eye contact, like they didn't want to get caught on the wrong side of this brewing fight. I walked straight up to the front and laid the notice down on the table in front of her. "What's this about?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. Karen barely glanced at it. "Your boat violates community standards," she said, her voice dripping with fake patience like she was talking to a child. "It's unsightly and disruptive. We've had complaints." Complaints. I looked around the room. Not a single person spoke up, not one. They all just shifted in their seats, some staring at their laps, others fiddling with their phones. The silence said everything. They hadn't complained. She had. "My boat isn't on your property," I said, my voice steady. "It's on my dock, on my water." Karen let out a small laugh, the kind meant to humiliate. "This is a community lake. Everyone has to follow the rules. If we let one person break them, it sets a bad example." I felt my jaw tighten. Community lake? That word, community, burned in my chest. I wanted to pull the deed out of my pocket. Right then and there, slam it on the table and watch her face fall, but I didn't, not yet. I wasn't going to waste my trump card so early. Instead, I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make people lean forward to hear. "What exactly do you plan to do if I don't move it?" Her smile widened. "We'll fine you. Every day it stays there. And if you continue to ignore the rules, we can escalate. You'd be surprised how quickly violations add up. Escalate." I knew what that meant. Harassment, legal threats, more notices plastered on my door, more letters stuffed into my mailbox. It was how they controlled people, death by 1,000 cuts. Most neighbors folded under the pressure. They didn't have the time or energy to fight. That was how the HOA kept its grip. But I wasn't most neighbors. I picked up the notice from the table and folded it neatly, sliding it into my pocket. "Noted," I said. Then I turned and walked out, leaving a heavy silence behind me. That night, I sat on my back porch, staring out at the lake. The moonlight rippled across the surface, and my boat floated quietly, tethered like it belonged to the water itself. I thought about all the families who came down every weekend, casting lines, teaching their kids to fish, paddling in their canoes. They'd never asked permission. I'd never demanded it. But the truth was, they owed those moments to me. Without my consent, they had no right to step foot in that water. And now Karen had given me a reason to remind them. Still, it wasn't an easy decision. I didn't like conflict. I wasn't the type to stir up trouble just to prove a point. But there comes a time when patience becomes weakness, and kindness becomes a weapon used against you. I'd spent years being generous, quietly allowing others to enjoy what I had paid for. But that generosity had turned into entitlement. They thought they could dictate terms. They thought they could order me around. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. If I let them win this battle, it wouldn't stop with the boat. Next, it would be the dock, then maybe my backyard fence, or the color of my house, or who I invited over. I'd seen it happen to others, neighbors squeezed into submission, forced to live by rules they never agreed to. Not me. By the end of the week, things started to escalate just like Karen promised. Another notice arrived. This time, the fine. Schedule attached. $50 a day if the boat wasn't moved. Then a letter about further legal action if I refused. Neighbors whispered when I passed, some apologetic, others too nervous to even say hello. I could feel the tension. In the air, thick as the summer humidity. One afternoon, I caught Karen and 2 other board members standing by the lake, pointing at my boat. They didn't see me watching from my window. Karen gestured with her hands, sharp movements like she was carving the air in anger. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I knew what she was saying. We'll make him move it. We'll show him who's in charge. But every time I saw their determination, my own only grew stronger. Because I had something they didn't, something they had completely forgotten. I owned the lake, and soon I was going to remind them of that fact, in a way they would never forget. The following weekend, I decided to confront the situation head-on. I wasn't going to sit inside while the HOA acted like they owned my life. I grabbed a cup of coffee and walked down to the dock just as the sun started to rise. Mist still hovered above the water, and the air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine from the trees lining the lake. It should have been peaceful, but something in my stomach twisted as I approached. By the time I reached the end of my dock, I froze. Half a dozen of them were already there. Karen, 2 board members, and a handful of residents from the neighborhood fishing club. Lines cast, chairs set up, laughter spilling over the calm morning. They didn't even notice me. They assumed, like everyone else, that the lake was theirs for the taking. I felt my chest tighten, not from anger alone, but from the weight of all the years I'd let this happen. All the times I smiled and nodded while they claimed a little bit of my lake as their own. All the weekends I'd given them free access, thinking it was neighborly. They had turned generosity into entitlement. And now, this bold display of disregard was the final straw. I cleared my throat, loud enough for them to hear. Heads snapped up, and the laughter died instantly. Karen's eyes narrowed the second she saw me. "Morning," I said calmly, stepping onto the dock. "Lovely day for fishing, isn't it?" She tilted her chin, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, it's beautiful. But I think you received our notice, didn't you?" I let a small smirk slip. "I did." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And I've been thinking about it." Karen's hands tightened around her fishing rod. "Well, the rules are clear. You need to move your boat. It's disrupting the community, and further fines are in effect." "Disrupting the community?" I echoed, my voice soft but firm. "Do you know how many weekends I've watched families here? Kids learning to fish, couples laughing on kayaks, all because I allowed it. Every inch of water you're standing on belongs to me." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm I had ever seen. Their faces flickered with confusion, disbelief, and finally, panic. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. 2 of the board members glanced at each other, whispering urgently. I could see the tension building like a rope being pulled taut. "You own this lake?" Karen asked finally, voice sharp and defensive. "Yes," I said, letting it sink in. Every drop, every inch of shoreline. I hold the deed. I've let you use it for years out of kindness, not because you have any legal right. And now, I'm tired of being taken for granted. For a moment, I thought they would laugh. Maybe Karen would roll her eyes, and the residents would shrug it off thinking I was bluffing. But I could see the shift in them. Faces went pale. Chairs scraped against the wooden dock. Karen's hands trembled slightly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded notice, then unfolded it carefully. "This," I said, pointing at it, "was your attempt at control. Your little fines and threats, and here's the truth. None of it matters." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. We can take this to court." I laughed softly, the kind of laugh that cuts through arrogance. "Go ahead. Bring it on. Every time you step onto this lake without my permission, it's trespassing. I've got lawyers on standby. I've got every document you could possibly need. And unlike you, I'm prepared to follow through." Suddenly, one of the residents, a man I recognized from their weekend club, stepped forward. "Wait. You mean we've been trespassing?" "Yes," I said calmly. "Every time you've cast a line, every boat ride, every tournament. Technically, it's been on my property. Out of generosity, I've never enforced it. But now the rules are clear." The whispers began, spreading like wildfire. "I thought it was community property. I didn't know. We've been fishing here for years." Karen's face twisted into fury. She jabbed a finger at me. "This isn't fair. You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, "because I own it, and I decide who gets access." She glared, but even she could feel the weight of the truth pressing against her. Her control, her carefully constructed power over the neighborhood, was crumbling in front of everyone. And for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. It wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about pride, about reputation, about the illusion of control she had built over the entire community. And now, that illusion was gone. I stepped closer to the edge of the dock, looking out over the water. My boat rocked gently, waiting. My heart was racing, a strange mixture of adrenaline and vindication. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but it had. They had forced my hand, and now I was going to remind them that generosity isn't weakness, and entitlement has consequences. Karen finally turned her back, muttering under her breath, while the others shuffled awkwardly, realizing for the first time that they were standing on someone else's property. The tension was electric, the kind that makes the air feel thick and hard to breathe. No one moved, no one spoke. The calm lake reflected their shock, and I realized just how powerful that silence could be. I knew this was just the beginning. This confrontation wasn't over. The stakes had risen, the lines were drawn, and the neighborhood was about to see a side of me they had never expected. And as I watched Karen storm off, I couldn't help but feel a small, grim smile. They had underestimated me. Big mistake. Thought the confrontation at the dock would be enough to make them understand, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. That Monday morning, I woke to a frantic knock on my door. The sunlight was barely filtering through the blinds, and I still hadn't fully shaken off the weekend adrenaline. When I opened it, I found Karen standing there, her usual composure replaced by a mix of panic and fury. Behind her, two board members lingered, their faces pale. "Please," she began, almost pleading. "We need to talk. You can't take the lake away from everyone like this." I stepped aside to let them in. "Take a seat," I said calmly, though my pulse was already quickening. "Let's make one thing clear. I haven't taken anything. This lake is mine. You've had access out of my generosity, nothing more. And now you've left me no choice but to enforce my rights." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't understand the consequences. The entire community will turn against you. I understand perfectly," I interrupted, holding up my hands. "The difference is, I'm not afraid of consequences that come from people overstepping their bounds. You've been using this lake for years, assuming it was free, for the taking. That stops now." They shifted uncomfortably in the living room, and I could see Karen struggling to maintain the illusion of authority. She opened her mouth, hesitated, and then said something that made my stomach drop. We We already rented boats for the weekend tournament, she admitted, her voice tight. People are coming. They've been planning this for months. If you don't let them use the lake, it's going to be chaos. There will be lawsuits, complaints. I froze for a moment. They had made plans, organized people, scheduled events, all under the assumption that I would continue to stay silent. And now, that assumption was shattered. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I see, I said slowly. So you expected me to let you ignore my property rights because it was convenient for you? Karen looked like she might argue, but she didn't. I could see the fear in her eyes. She realized I wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was real. By late afternoon, I decided it was time for action. I went down to the dock with a truck loaded with "No trespassing" signs and stakes. The sun glinted off the water, making the lake sparkle like it belonged to someone else entirely, which in fact it did. I started staking signs along the shoreline, each one a clear, unmissable message. Private property, no access without permission. I could feel my neighbors watching from their houses, whispering to one another. Some seemed shocked, others angry, but I couldn't let that stop me. This wasn't about popularity. This was about respect. Then, just as I was hammering the last sign into place, a commotion erupted from the far side of the lake. I squinted and saw Karen and the board, members trying to corral a group of residents toward the water, towing their rented boats behind them. One of the boats had a small motor, and it splashed recklessly as it hit the shore. "Stop!" I shouted. "You have no permission to be here!" For a moment they froze. Then Karen yelled back, "We've already paid! You can't do this! The community expects access!" I felt a surge of frustration mixed with disbelief. Paid? Paid for what? For years they had been using my lake for free, and now they were trying to turn it into a right they could buy? "You've been trespassing," I said sharply. "Your payment doesn't change that. Every person who steps onto this property without my consent is subject to legal action. You've been warned." A tense silence fell over the dock. The residents didn't move, unsure whether to retreat or press forward. Karen's face was red with fury, her hands shaking as she tried to regain control. And then, something completely unexpected happened. One of the neighbors, someone I had thought was neutral, stepped forward. "Wait," he said, his voice calm but firm. "He's right. This is his property. We've been acting like it isn't, but it is. We've been taking advantage of him." The words hung in the air like a weight. Karen's mouth opened and closed. But no rebuttal came. The tension crackled around us, thick and suffocating. I could see the reality setting in for everyone. The facade of control Karen had built was collapsing right in front of them. By sunset, the chaos had simmered into reluctant acceptance. Boats were towed back to garages. People muttered under their breath as they left the dock. Karen's final glare as she stormed off was something I would never forget. A mix of humiliation, fury, and fear. I stood on my dock, watching the lake in the golden light of evening. My boat floated silently, untouched. The lake was quiet, peaceful, exactly as it should be. But something had shifted. The neighborhood had learned a hard lesson, and I had discovered something about myself. I realized I wasn't just protecting property anymore. I was protecting respect, fairness, and the right to enforce boundaries when people refused to see them. And the storm that had begun at the dock was far from over, because if they thought this was the end, they were wrong. This was only the beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. By the time Tuesday morning rolled around, the neighborhood had transformed. Word of the confrontation at the lake had spread like wildfire. From the moment I stepped outside, I could feel the tension crackling in the air. Windows opened just a fraction, curtains twitching as neighbors peeked to see if the lake owner was still standing his ground. I was both relieved and wary. Relieved because the word of my authority had begun to sink in, wary because I knew this wouldn't end quietly. I spent the early hours walking along the shoreline, inspecting the IS stakes I'd hammered in the previous day. Every no trespassing sign gleamed in the morning light, a stark reminder that I was no longer the neighbor who quietly tolerated. I had drawn a line, and crossing it now carried consequences. But just as I was straightening the last sign, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. A group had gathered near the far end of the lake, Karen and the board members, conspiring like they hadn't learned anything at all. They were moving small equipment, preparing for some sort of workaround. My heart pounded as I realized they were trying to bypass me, to sneak in under the radar. I gritted my teeth. This wasn't going to be subtle anymore. I walked toward them, my boots crunching against the gravel, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Stop! Right there!" Karen spun, her face a mix of disbelief and fury. "You can't do this! We've organized this for months! People are coming!" "You organized. Your own trespassing," I said, my tone sharper now, leaving no room for debate. "I warned you. Every action you take without my permission is illegal. Every boat, every line cast, every step you take on this water, you're trespassing. And this time, I'm enforcing it." For a moment, I thought she might try to argue. But then, to my surprise, something unexpected happened. One of the residents, older, respected by the community, stepped forward. His voice was calm, but unwavering. "He's right," he said. "We've been taking this lake for granted. I don't care how upset Karen is. This is his property. We should have respected that from the beginning." Karen's eyes flicked to him, a flash of panic crossing her features. "You can't just... This isn't fair." Fair. That word stung because I realized it had always been about fairness to them and never about respect to me. They had assumed my generosity was infinite, that my patience was weakness, and now that assumption was about to shatter completely. I stepped closer, letting my voice carry across the water. "You've had access because I allowed it. You've enjoyed this lake for free for years, but I won't let entitlement replace respect. Today that ends. Everyone leaves." A few minutes later, Karen's group began packing up, muttering, glaring, but unable to argue effectively. They knew the truth, and deep down, they feared the consequences if they tried to push further. The residents trickled back to their homes, uneasy, whispering, realizing that their beloved weekend plans had evaporated overnight. By mid-afternoon, I returned to the dock alone, surveying the lake. My boat rocked gently in the sun, untouched. I should have felt victorious, but instead I felt a gnawing tension. Karen wouldn't let this go quietly. The storm brewing inside her was far from over. That evening, I received the first real sign of escalation. An official letter slipped under my door. The HOA had retained a lawyer, citing unlawful interference with community activities and threatening legal action. I laughed quietly to myself as I read it. Legal threats? I had anticipated this. Every argument, every scenario, every move had been planned carefully. I owned the lake. The law was on my side, and I wasn't bluffing. Still, I couldn't ignore the knot of unease in my stomach. Karen had power and influence, and she wasn't the type to give up gracefully. I knew she would try something, anything, to regain control. She might call neighbors, organize protests, or even sneak onto the lake at night. Every scenario flashed through my mind as I stared across the shimmering water, plotting my next moves. And then, just as darkness fell, I noticed it. Lights bobbing near the far shore. Figures moving stealthily. They were attempting to access the lake under the cover of night. My pulse quickened, and I felt the adrenaline surge. This wasn't just a battle over rules anymore. This had become personal. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried down to the dock. The beams cut across the water, illuminating shadows moving among the reeds. "Stop! This is private property!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the lake. The figures froze. Karen's voice rang out from the darkness, sharp and furious. You can't do this! People will be furious if we cancel everything! I stepped into the beam of my flashlight, revealing the trespassers' stunned faces. I already warned you, I said. This is no longer a suggestion. You've chosen to ignore it. I'm not giving another chance. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then slowly they began retreating, heads down, muttering. I kept the light trained on them until they disappeared into the shadows, hearts probably pounding as much as mine. I finally lowered the flashlight, breathing heavily. The lake was quiet again. My boat floated silently, untouchable. But I knew this was far from over. Karen's desperation would grow, her tactics more extreme, and the neighborhood was already dividing. I realized then that the battle wasn't just about a boat, a dock, or even a lake. It was about control, respect, and the courage to stand firm when everyone else expected you to bend. And I had no intention of bending. The night air was heavy, filled with tension and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new confrontations. But I also knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had finally taken control, and no one, not Karen, not the board, not anyone, would take it from me without a fight. The neighborhood would be buzzing tomorrow, whispers spreading like wildfire. Some would be angry, some supportive, all realizing that the balance of power had shifted. Karen's obsession had pushed her too far, and I had held my ground. But I also knew that the fallout was only beginning. Emails, letters, complaints. This confrontation would not end quietly. The legal battle might come, and her pride would drive her to try anything to regain control. I felt a cold awareness settle in. This wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of a new phase, one where I would need to stay vigilant, assertive, and unyielding. As the sun dipped below the trees, casting the lake in a golden glow, I allowed myself a small, quiet sigh of relief. The climax had passed. The confrontation had ended in my favor. My boat floated peacefully on the water, untouchable. The lake, my sanctuary, remained mine. But deep down, I knew one thing. Part of the story was still unfolding. The next moves from Karen and the HOA would determine how the neighborhood adjusted to this new reality, and whether anyone else would test the limits of my patience. For now, I sat in my boat, letting the calm wash over me, knowing that tomorrow would bring the consequences, the reactions, and perhaps the resolution that this battle had been building toward for years. The morning after the showdown, the neighborhood felt different. Walking down the street, I noticed quiet glances from neighbors, some curious, some apologetic, and some still stubbornly resentful. But there was a new understanding in their eyes. The lake wasn't just a shared space. It was my property, my choice, my boundary. That realization had rippled through the community faster than any argument or warning ever could. Karen was noticeably absent. I didn't see her or the board members that morning. The rumors were already circulating. She was fuming, talking to lawyers, probably plotting her next move, but the energy she once projected over the neighborhood had been replaced by caution. It was a small victory, but a significant one. I made my way to the dock, the sun rising behind the trees, casting golden streaks across the water. My boat floated peacefully, tethered, serene. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to just breathe. The lake reflected my face in the water, calm yet strong, a reminder of the stand I had taken. As I sat there, I realized just how much this battle had taught me. It wasn't just about property rights, fines, or HOA rules. It was about self-respect, boundaries, and the courage to enforce them when others assume they can ignore you. For years, I had let generosity be mistaken for weakness. I had allowed entitlement to creep in, thinking patience and kindness were enough. But this experience had reminded me that respect must be mutual, or it ceases to exist entirely. Later that afternoon, a few neighbors came down to the lake, hesitant, careful, but this time There was a different energy. One by one, they approached, me not to demand, but to ask permission. "Would it be okay if we fish here this weekend?" one asked softly. Another added, "We just want to enjoy the lake responsibly." I looked at them, really looked, and smiled. "Of course," I said. "You can enjoy it, but only if respect comes first. The rules are simple. No entitlement, no assumptions, no taking for granted what isn't yours. Follow those, and the lake is open." Their relief was visible, and the tension that had been building for weeks began to dissolve. I realized that this was the real victory, not the confrontation, not the legal rights, not even Karen's defeat, but the balance that had been restored. People could enjoy the lake again, but now with awareness and respect, not arrogance or assumption. By evening, I was alone again at the dock, the water glowing orange under the fading sun. My boat rocked gently, and the lake felt like it had healed from the recent storm. I thought about Karen, how her obsession with control had driven her to overstep, and how it had ultimately backfired. I didn't feel gloating satisfaction. I felt a quiet understanding that some people cannot be taught until consequences become undeniable. I also thought about myself, how easy it had been to allow boundaries to be ignored, to hope that patience and generosity alone would maintain harmony. But the truth was harsh and clear. Respect isn't assumed, it's demanded. And sometimes standing firm is the only way to teach it. That night, as I sat on the porch looking over the lake, I felt a profound sense of peace. The confrontation, the tension, the escalation, they had all led to this moment. I had stood my ground, asserted what was mine, and reminded everyone, including myself, of the power of boundaries. The lesson extended beyond the lake. Life often tests patience and kindness, but it also tests courage. The courage to act when silence and tolerance are mistaken for weakness, the courage to protect what is yours, and the courage to face conflict without fear. I had learned that lesson in a way I would never forget. As the stars began to appear, above the water, I smiled softly. The lake was quiet, my boat was safe, and the neighborhood had learned something essential. Respect cannot be taken lightly. It must be earned, and it must be honored. I leaned back, letting the night air wash over me. There would always be challenges, conflicts, and people who pushed too far, but I knew now that I had the strength to face them, and the wisdom to know when to let generosity guide me and when to draw the line. And as I watched the moonlight shimmer across the surface of the lake, I realized something deeper. Standing, firm, protecting what is rightfully yours, and insisting on respect doesn't just shape the world around you, it shapes the person you are. The lake belonged to me, yes. But more importantly, I belonged to myself. And I had never felt stronger, clearer, or more at peace. The storm had passed. The calm had returned. And this time, it was mine to keep. By Wednesday morning, the tension in the neighborhood had become palpable. I could feel it in the way people looked at me as I stepped outside, half curious, half afraid. Windows opened just a crack, eyes peeking out to watch if I'd make a move. The lake, my sanctuary, had become the center of a quiet storm. And at the heart of it all was Karen. I knew she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. The confrontation, the humiliation, the loss of control. It had lit a fire in her that no prideful person could ignore. And I could feel it coming, like a storm gathering in the distance, inevitable and unstoppable. I spent the morning checking the perimeter, making sure every no trespassing sign was secure, the stakes firm in the ground. Every corner of my shoreline was marked, every inch of access clear. My boat floated silently, serene, as if mocking the chaos that had erupted around it. But I knew serenity wouldn't last. Karen had already proven that she would try anything. By late afternoon, I saw the first real sign of her escalation. A group of people appeared on the far side of the lake, dragging equipment I hadn't seen before. Small rowboats, a makeshift dock section, even a few fishing cages. It was clear. She was trying to circumvent my restrictions. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't negotiating. She was attempting to assert control by force. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight, knowing I couldn't let this slide. I strode to the dock, boots crunching on gravel, every muscle tense. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the water. I could see the panic and determination on their faces. Karen's expression a mix of fury and disbelief. The others, looking nervous but willing to follow her lead. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice carrying across the lake. "This is private property. You are trespassing." Karen froze, but only for a moment. Then, with that relentless stubbornness I had come to expect, she barked back, "We're just trying to enjoy our lake. You can't take this away from everyone." I stepped closer to the edge of my dock, my fists clenched. "Enjoy your lake? This is my lake, every inch of it. And every step you take without my permission is illegal. I warned you. Now I enforce it." There was a tense pause. I could feel the eyes of the neighbors hidden behind trees, watching, waiting. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a reckoning. Then, as if to push me further, Karen gave a small, defiant smile and motioned to the group. They stepped forward, trying to nudge one of the rowboats into the water. My chest tightened, adrenaline surging. I knew I couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. I grabbed my phone and called my lawyer. Calmly, I explained the situation, giving every detail. Within minutes, he confirmed what I already knew. I was fully protected. Every measure I had taken, every warning I had given, every no trespassing sign, they were all legally enforceable. Karen and her crew were walking straight into a legal trap they didn't even realize existed. Still, knowing I had the law on my side didn't make it less tense. I had to act fast. I waded into the shallow edge of the lake, water lapping at my boots, and moved toward the intruding rowboats. The group hesitated, shocked to see me so bold, but Karen's shouts tried to mask their uncertainty. "This is your final warning," I yelled, my voice echoing across the water. "Step back, or I will take legal action immediately." For a long, terrifying moment, no one moved. The sun dipped lower, painting the lake in gold and crimson. The stillness was almost unbearable. I could see Karen weighing her options, desperation creeping into her eyes. She realized that this wasn't just a game anymore. I wasn't bluffing. Then, to my astonishment, one of the older residents, the same man who had spoken up before, stepped forward. "Karen, we need to stop. This isn't right. We've been taking this for granted. He owns it. We can't just ignore it." Her face twisted in anger and disbelief. "You're siding with him?" she spat. "Yes," he said firmly. "He's right. This is private property. We've been wrong." I could see the weight of realization crashing down on her. For the first time, she looked truly powerless. The people who had blindly followed her were now stepping away, some nodding at me in quiet approval, others simply retreating. Karen's fury broke over her like a tidal wave. "This isn't over," she screamed, voice cracking. "You haven't heard the last of me." I watched her storm off, dragging her supporters with her, muttering threats that I knew would amount to nothing. My chest heaved, adrenaline still surging. The lake was quiet again. My boat floated, untouchable. I stood there for a long moment, looking out over the water, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph. The battle had escalated to a peak, and I had survived it. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't over. Karen wouldn't disappear quietly. Her pride, her obsession with control guaranteed that. And that knowledge made my heart race again, not with fear, but with anticipation. Because if she returned, if the conflict escalated further, I would be ready. Every step I had taken, every plan I had laid, had prepared me for this moment. The calm before the storm was over. The real test of courage, strategy, and resolve, was just beginning. And as I watched the sun disappear behind the trees, casting the lake into shadow, I realized something important. I wasn't just defending a boat. I was defending my right to stand firm, to protect what was mine, and to teach a lesson about respect that the neighborhood would never forget. Tomorrow, I knew, would change everything. By Thursday morning, I knew Karen wouldn't give up quietly. She had a stubbornness that bordered on obsession, and after the weekend of confrontations, I was certain she was planning something drastic. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from neighbors, half supportive, half anxious. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the next act in this battle over the lake. I decided to go down to the dock early, before anyone else could make a move. The lake was quiet, smooth as glass, reflecting the pale gold of the rising sun. My boat rocked gently at the end of the dock, serene, unthreatened. I should have felt calm, but I didn't. I knew the real storm was coming, and then I saw them. A group of people moving at the far end of the lake, carrying larger equipment than before. Kayaks, small motors, even one of the rented rowboats from the weekend. Karen was at the center, her face pale but defiant, directing the operation like a general preparing for battle. My stomach twisted, not with fear, but with adrenaline. This was it, the final push, the climax of everything that had been building for days. I walked toward the water, keeping my voice calm, but firm. "Karen, stop! You are trespassing," she turned, eyes blazing. "You think a few signs and threats can scare us off? This lake belongs to the community, and we're going to use it." My fists clenched. "You've been using it under my generosity. That ends now. Step back, or I will take immediate legal action." Her defiance didn't waver. If anything, it sharpened. She signaled to the group, and they began pushing one of the rowboats into the water. My heart pounded, and instinctively, I ran down the dock, stopping just short of the water's edge. "This is your final warning," I shouted. "Every step you take past this line is illegal. Stop now!" For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The rowboat wavered, half in the water, half on the gravel. Karen's hand trembled slightly as she tried to maintain control, her voice cracking with frustration. You can't do this! People are counting on this lake!" Counting on it. The words struck me harder than anything she had said before. For years I had let people assume, take, and rely on my generosity. And now she was demanding it as a right. My chest tightened. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about principle, respect, and the courage to stand firm when everyone else expected you to bend. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain steady. "You had years to respect boundaries. You didn't. Now the choice is yours. Step back or face the consequences." And then, something I hadn't expected happened. One of the residents, the same older man who had spoken up before, stepped forward, placing himself between the rowboat and the dock. "Karen," he said firmly, "he's right. This is private property. We've been wrong. It ends now." Karen froze. I could see the panic flicker across her face as she realized she was losing her support. The others hesitated, unsure whether to follow her or retreat. The tension was electric, every heartbeat thundering in my ears. Slowly, one by one, the group began backing away. The rowboat was pulled out of the water. Equipment was carried back to the shore. Karen's defiance remained, but it was fragile now, cracking under the weight of reality. This isn't over," she spat, her voice shaking. "You'll regret this. People will talk." I stood firm, every inch of my body radiating determination. "I've been patient. I've been generous. That patience ends where respect begins. This lake is mine, and until respect is shown, it stays that way." The group finally dispersed, muttering under their breath. Karen's glare followed me as I walked back to my boat, a mix of fury, humiliation, and disbelief etched on her face. She stormed off toward the road, dragging a few supporters behind her, but it was clear the battle had been lost, at least for now. I sank into my boat, letting the calm water rock me gently. My body was tense, exhausted from the adrenaline, but my mind was racing with the reality of what had just happened. I had stood my ground, enforced my rights, and reminded everyone that generosity has limits. But more than that, I had reminded myself of my own strength.